Excited to have someone here back by popular demand, Cathey, to talk to us about two topics today. So the first one we'll talk about is on the winter storm Uri, or the Polar Vortex. So we'll have about 45 minutes to talk about this topic. We'll then take a break, and then we'll be back up on stage to talk about Grid of the Future. So Cathey is the Director of System Planning from the Southwest Power Pool. He's a 19-year veteran of the power industry with expertise in energy markets, grid operations, and transmission planning. He holds a Bachelor in Science of Electrical Engineering from Louisiana State University, an MBA, and has been a registered professional engineer for 14 years. We'll go ahead and turn it over to Cathey, and just for matters of facilitating this, we will take a few questions during, so if you have a clarifying question on the screen, please throw your hand up. There will be microphones out in the audience, but then we will also save time at the end. So without further ado, please welcome Cathey.
All right. Okay, good afternoon. Speak up. Have an icebreaker. So you have one executive says to another executive, I think we really need to invest in solar. Well, the other executive replies, it's not going to happen overnight. All right. There you go. I'm done. Okay. So the next 45 minutes, I will be spending a lot of time talking about this winter storm that you all probably lived through, either in your work or your personal lives. You've probably experienced. But I want to make sure it's valuable, so from an SPP perspective, I'll be going over some graphs and some information, but as Courtney mentioned, if you guys have any questions, I definitely want to make sure this is valuable and try to answer your questions. At the end, I do want to spend about 15 minutes talking about resource adequacy. I think that's really important, and we kind of reserve this space to talk about it as opposed to the second topic after the break. So the big picture, we had this winter storm. It was mid-February of this year. And February 15th and 16th were really the heavy days, but it was really an issue all week long. There were a lot of positives that came out of this, and so you can kind of look at it from different angles. I believe the CEO panel kind of touched on this morning, but there was a lot of coordination and communication across SPP and ERCOT and MISO and PJM, our neighboring entities. We had a lot of imports through SPP, and so I think upwards of 6 gigawatts, and that gives you kind of an indication. Typically, we have 500 to 1,500 megawatts import or export out of SPP, so 6,000 megawatts importing into SPP was really pushing the boundaries that I've ever seen since 2006. I've never seen something to that extent or that amount of magnitude. We also had coordinated load shed. No one wants to turn off their lights. There was a lot of confusion going on, I think, in the public space around how load shed works with SPP, considering it was really more of a southern state problem. You have winterization, kind of, if you're in the generation area, winterization happens, the investment happens more north of Oklahoma. Obviously, we're in Nebraska, so you probably have a lot of winterization in your plans and knowledge of that. But south of Kansas, it doesn't really happen, and hence Texas had a major problem. And so we tried to help Texas as well. So we used every megawatt we could get. That's kind of interesting because when you talk about resource adequacy, it's really a statistical analysis and assessment to understand, how much capacity do you need to be able to meet your load given certain scenarios. You can't build capacity overnight. And so it's really just an algorithm, and it's a methodology to come up with valuing certain attributes of generation in your mix. Well, when you look at this past winter storm and you say, did you have any generation that was unavailable or that you didn't use? The answer is we called every single megawatt that we know about. So SPP during the energy emergency alert in February 15th and 16th, the answer is yes. If there's any generator that wasn't in pieces and it wasn't on outage, we called on it. We used every single bit that we could possibly get. And so that kind of begs a question about resource adequacy, because then you say, okay, well, we have a 12% reserve margin, planning reserve margin, to make sure that you're kind of adhering to some variability in the long-term plan and viability and resilience of SPP as a region. Well, in this particular instance, I mean, it's maybe an 80-year storm, maybe it'll happen in 10 years, maybe it'll happen this winter, who's to say? But we used everything that we had, and we still had problems and had to have load shed. So resource adequacy is a really big topic, not just for renewables, but also for just the transition that we have experienced. So it covered 73% of the mainland. It set a bunch of records. You guys kind of know this, but I do like this map, and I don't know if there's oh, cool. So you kind of have that line of winterization is right in the middle of SPP, right between Kansas and Oklahoma. So all of these regions generally, I mean, it's kind of up to the investment and the utility, but generally they don't have winterization and the ability to sustain the temperatures that we had down there. And we saw that. The equipment was frozen. A lot of the gas pipeline, that was a really big issue, is the deliverability on the gas side. So even resources that had firm gas weren't able to actually get the gas. The gas wellheads were frozen. There was a number of different issues upstream from generation that led to some of the outages. So what led to the temporary service interruptions? It was a supply issue. It was a supply and demand problem. We had too much demand, not enough supply, and gas was a primary issue. Now, all generators had problems, but in terms of just the sheer magnitude of gas, we had, I believe, over 20 gigawatts of gas that did not show up. So more than half of what we actually called on from the gas plants for the region did not show up. So just, that's very difficult as an operator to be able to call on everything and only get less than half to actually show up during the winter event. So it was a stressful time. Rapid reduction of energy imports. So I mentioned that we had at times up to 6 gigawatts importing SPP region. And we were also exporting down to ERCOT. You say, well, why were you exporting down to ERCOT? From a reliability perspective, Reliability Coordination and Balancing Authority, they were actually shedding upwards of 40% of their load, and we were in the single digits. And so it's a matter of just managing expectations of what is the value of load and being able to help your neighbors. So we actually helped them by 800 megawatts. We were importing 6 gigawatts. And then our neighbors started hitting transmission congestion in MISO and PJM. They also had supply issues. They were also in the storm as well. And so they started curtailing the imports that we were having. And it was a direct correlation. Once those curtailments happened, importing in SPP, we had to shed load. We had to issue an EA3. So I'm going to skip. This is the time frame. Monday, the 15th and the 16th, we actually had an energy emergency alert 3 the morning and the morning of the Tuesday, the 16th as well. So in my career at SPP, I've been at SPP for 15 years. I've never seen us shed load, much less call an EA3. So, this was pretty serious for us. We've always had capacity to be able to serve. So this was a very unique situation. The question is, how unique is it? Is it going to happen next year? Is it going to happen in 10 years? How do we swing the needle towards being more reliable and resilient such that if this happens again, can we build the system up such that we winterize some of those resources, such that we require firm gas, such that we have maybe a higher planning reserve margin. Maybe we increase the planning reserve margin for the winter. We don't do a planning reserve margin right now for the winter. All of this costs money. It all comes down to balancing the likelihood of this happening again versus how much investment we're actually going to have to require. And that's all being discussed in SPP world. MPP, OPPD, and LES are very much involved in that and trying to understand what policies and procedures do we need to be able to move the needle a little bit further to be able to prepare and react to something like this. So after the storm, we had no less than 24 audits. That's always fun. Just a lot of inquiries and questions and trying to understand what happened and all the steps and so forth. So we've been trying to work with FERC and NERC on that. They came out with their guidelines. And a lot of our improvements that we identified meshed well with their guidelines, so we were on the same page as far as what they recommended. One thing One thing that we stood up as a region is the Improved Resource Adequacy Task Force. And so the Regional State Committee commissioners from all of our 14 states in SPP's region, we have a task force necessary to look at all of those particular recommendations. Since we're not the resource planner, we don't actually, I think that was mentioned earlier as well, SPP doesn't plan resources, but what we do is we set the requirements we need to run a reliable balancing authority for the region. And so now we're working very closely with the states to say, okay, what else do we need to do? And that's to the resource adequacy pieces. And so what we've done is we've identified a number of recommendations from this winter weather event, and we've tiered them into 3 buckets, 3 tiers. And our board of directors at SPP has required us to meet all of the tier 1 recommendations by the end of 2022. So that's kind of our priority, is these tier 1 recommendations. And then we have the tier 2 and tier 3, which are not, I guess I would say they're not bad ideas. It's just from a priority perspective, we're trying to stage this out to where it's getting the best bang for our buck. Because all of us, I mean, everybody in the room is probably extremely busy with your own business. SPP's the same way. The industry's changing. We have to balance everything that's on our plate. And so that's what we've done with the recommendations from the winter weather. We've also tiered them into actions, policy, and assessments. Some of them are just studies. We just need to do a study. We can't just turn around and say, okay, the PRM needs to be 20%. We have to actually study and understand what it needs to be. So this gives you kind of an overview of what those are. Fuel assurance, resource planning, availability, those are our tier 1. That's our biggest bang, because when you look at what the problems were, it was a supply problem. Yes, we had transmission congestion, but for the most part, importing 6 gigawatts and being able to serve the load and not really having a lot of internal transmission congestion, it wasn't much of a transmission issue. There were some localized transmission problems, but by and large, it was a generation problem. We just did not have the gas necessary. We did not have the fleet necessary to be resilient against this particular storm for the period of time that we had it. Then you have a number of tier 2, so this gives you some examples like communication processes, emergency response and planning. We definitely need to improve there. SEAMS work is an action. Market design. So there's a number of markets and credits that kind of blew up in terms of settlements perspective, because when we hit scarcity pricing in our markets, resources we're actually spending, I think I've been told this, that that particular week cost more than the rest of the entire year in terms of just how the impact of scarcity pricing for fuel. That's pretty insightful and important, but it's also questions, do we have the infrastructure in our markets and settlements processes to be able to make sure we're not bankrupting somebody, which that happened in ERCOT. And so there's some lessons learned there. Again, it's a tier 2, but it's still important. Transmission planning is the same way. Again, it's not an issue necessarily, but we are exploring what's called risk-based planning or probabilistic planning. And I don't want to say that in a statistical manner. It's really saying, okay, if North Dakota, for instance, has a high load every winter and they have periods of low wind and one line trips, it's kind of like you hold your hand this way and you lift your leg that way, and then something might happen. But that happens. It's a question of how probable that is. And same thing with Nebraska. It's if you have a high transfer north to south and it goes through Nebraska every single season, every single winter season, do we actually prepare for that? Is it part of our overall long-term plan? And so what we're trying to do is make that improvement in the transmission planning process to where we're building up those particular scenarios. They're not traditional transmission planning scenarios. That's the thing, but they're things that actually happen. So, should we build and invest fixed resources in transmission to be able to prepare for that? Communications is another one. I was involved in a lot of this. I do think that communications, it's interesting because I've been told a few years ago, public appeals don't work. They actually worked for this, I guess we observed that load reduced. Maybe it was a coincidence that we did public appeals and load reduced. But I guess feel like the public appeals worked during this particular time frame. What was interesting is some of our utilities have actually pulled out public appeals from their emergency conditions or emergency procedures. And I asked them why, and they said, well, what we've seen in the past, this was a couple of years ago, but it's pretty interesting. What they've seen in the past, depending on the utility, is they'll issue public appeals and the load will go up. So I guess, some people are selfish and they say, well, public appeals, I'm about to lose my power, so they run their dishwasher and they run the dryer, and I guess everybody's thinking that, so they actually see a blip up in the load. I just thought that was interesting. We didn't see that here. So public appeals did have some tangible or measurable reduction in load. So to dive a little bit further in the Tier 1 recommendations, fuel assurance is really important, but this is a problem. It's a problem with gas and electric coordination, and we're digging very far into the gas industry. From SPP perspective, we just set up the rules and we say, okay, fine, you have a firm resource. You just tell us you need to be there and perform. Well, then it's up to the individual utility to be able to work out their fuel, whether it's a coal pile, if it's wind, it's incremental wind that's there, I guess. Nuclear facility, everyone has their own particular attributes and technologies behind actually hitting the grid with electrons. And so, from a gas perspective, what we're learning is, you could buy firm gas, but that's going to get curtailed as well. If the infrastructure is not built up to be able to handle it during these types of events, what are we actually doing other than just inflating the costs of these gas plants, because now they're having to buy firm fuel? And so that's being discussed as well as, okay, well, fine, if that doesn't work, what will incentivize the gas industry to upgrade their system to be able to be more resilient or responsive to the firm power plants that we actually have that have capacity accreditation? So we're having those kind of conversations because that was a really key component of why we had some issues. Resource planning availability, I'll get into this in a little bit from the reliability attributes necessary for resource. Well, I'll do it right now. So you have different generators, right? You could look at wind. Is wind very good when you need to call upon, I'm gonna do a quiz. Is wind very good when you need to call them for regulation up? Like you need to, everybody turned on their coffee pots in the morning and wind is already blowing. Is it real good about, responding to that up regulation, and you need to, no, just people are shaking their heads, no. Is solar real good at contingency reserves when Cooper, a nuclear facility, trips? Is solar good about, the sun's already out, right? So, okay, say no, say yes, just make it interactive. Obviously this is a wind and solar, and I'm a proponent for it. The technology is great. Every generator has pros and cons and different attributes. We need certain things on the grid, and we've actually gotten to 84% wind serving load in SPP as a region. That's pretty wild, because I remember being nervous about 40%, and now we're regularly over 50, 60%, and we're hitting 84%. So that's massive. But we need primary frequency response. We need system inertia. We need to be able to maintain 60 hertz. If Cooper trips, we need enough rampable capacity. I don't care if it's gas. You could hold back the wind, but someone's going to have to pay for that. But you hold it back and then you release it, and that is somewhat of an upward dispatchability. We're working on that and figuring out, okay, can we start doing that? It doesn't have to be gas, but we need some upward mobility when we actually lose Cooper. And so we're working on identifying all those particular generation attributes. We've been doing this for a number of years, mostly in the operations realm and markets. Now we're starting to look at it from a resource adequacy perspective, because we're starting to actually get tight on the amount of retirements that we're seeing and the amount of wind and solar that's being installed. They're not one-to-one. We're seeing retirements happen faster than we're getting solar on the grid. And so, part of that's GI interconnection queue. We can talk about that maybe later if you want, but that's one big piece. Is we need to identify what we need over the next 5 to 10 years and then value it appropriately, either through some kind of carrot where it would be a market product and we incentivize people to actually want to show up. Maybe they could be a battery and they could respond to certain time shifting regulation. And we've seen that in other markets. Batteries are really good about responding in short bursts. Or a stick where we increase the PRM and we basically say we're going to have a winter PRM and it's going to be 18%. We're going to have a summer PRM and it's 12%. Well, the resource planners are going to have to plan accordingly. It's going to cost money. And I mean, that is somewhat of a stick, but it is certainly reliable. This is another thing we're working on. So we have all the actuals, like all this data to the left of that's real data. That's basically the fuel mix, across time. And so you have coal, gas, wind, solar, and other. You have gas with the blue, wind is the green as it's ramping up. Obviously, we've been installing a lot of wind. Solar is negligible right now, but we're actually seeing an uptick in the near future as we declog the GI queue. And then coal is continuing to reduce. These are our two futures that we just recently, it's the 2021 ITP. So we do certain assumptions and we look at the queue, we look at industry trends, we work with the members, we try to understand what's retiring, what's actually being added, and we try to predict the fuel mix. And so what we're also doing is taking this information, and I don't have a graph for this, but all the stuff that I talked about with generation attributes, what we're trying to do is stage that out over a decade. And we're saying, okay, this is where the retirements are going, this is where the renewables are going, what do we need on the system? And try to stage that out in priority order. So if we're going to run out of ramp, for instance, and that's really, I'm making that on purpose, ramp and energy is our primary concern. Primary frequency response and system inertia and voltage control and so forth, that's kind of secondary. What's right in front of our face is retiring resources that are rampable and doing it faster than we can get enough wind and solar and batteries on the system to kind of complement that reduction. And so what we're trying to do is forecast that and then back up from that and build the policies and procedures and tools necessary to be able to adhere to that. Because right now it's kind of flying in the dark. We're processing the retirements, we're processing the generation queue, but we're not technically valuing the rampable capacity that we already have that's there that we use every single day. I'm going to try to go through these slides a little bit fast. I don't know what time, how much? 20? Okay. Yeah, I'm going to go through this a little bit faster. So I included this because you have 0 to 90 gigs. This is how much generation we technically, I say technically, it's resources that are out there and they exist. Whether or not they perform is a whole nother question. And so we actually had a number of generator outages. I mean, again, this is the winter, and there were some generation that was just out that was already planned for, and we tried to obviously move those, but if they're already in pieces, you're not going to put them back in a couple of days. And so that's that green. But then you had this unavailable capacity. Basically, this is the capacity that should have been there but wasn't. So when you look at the black as our load and our available capacity, this blue should have been way up in this region. We should have been okay. So what we're trying to do is focus on this orange or yellow region. This is another good graph. I like this because what we did is take the 2016 to 2020. This is the entire fleet of available generation that we've had for January and February and March. And so you can see kind of fluctuations throughout the month of February. Totaled over those years, and in 2021, and this is the winter event, and this is just how dramatically different. This is 2021, and then as it went down, so it just kind of illustrates just the amount of generation. It was a supply and demand problem. We've never had that, not even close, that least low amount. Another illustration. So with the purple, this is the imports that we had. Had we not had those imports, we would have, all this purple area would have been near load shed. So, transmission, seams projects, being able to import from our neighbors, that's really important. But again, we still need to manage the generation that wasn't there that was supposed to be there. And this is another one. So just showing you the performance of wind. Let's see, wind is green and hydro. And so from an outage perspective, gas just ramped up. Gas just had a lot of problems. Okay. I want to skip to the resource adequacy, but before I do, one note on, we've had some questions about locked up generation. We did back down generation during the winter event while we were shedding load. And that doesn't make sense, right? People say, well, why are you doing that? You still have room over them this generation. We had some local transmission congestion. So here's Lake Nebraska. This was the morning of the 15th, or evening of the 15th. So let's skip in there. And so when we hit these generation, you have a generator that's up in here. Maybe it's electrically a little bit further away, or maybe even on the west side of Nebraska. You're hitting those transmission constraints. And so even though we're having to shed load regionally, you have locked up local generation. And so for the most part, transmission worked, but we did have hit some limitation. This kind of breaks down the interruptions that happened. And so the philosophy, and we came up with this years ago, and now it's being questioned, which, rightly so, it's a lessons learned, but it's a load ratio of shares. So the approach that we do load shedding is we're all in this together. We calculate resource adequacy together. So when we have capacity emergency situations, we shed load together. Now, some people don't really see it that way. They see it, okay, well, it's, we were fine in the north and it was a southern problem, so why didn't the south curtail more or whatever? That's being discussed, but that's not the approach that we do. We do a load shed, and it's all member driven. Nebraska entities have a say in that too, and so just try to figure out what is the best, most equitable way to do this, because, you gotta be careful about what you wish for, because the next time, if you vote for something that says, well, let's punish the ones that were actually short, well, the next time you may be short. So you got to think through all the different examples of how that might actually work. But you can see Nebraska was part of it for these particular interruptions. So resource adequacy, I want to spend a little bit of time, keep skipping. Okay. I mentioned earlier, and this is just one of the concerns that we have at SPP is we have retirements that are happening quickly, and bless you. And so we have we rely on about roughly 3 to 6 gigawatts of quicker starting resources to be able to bounce across the wind, and that we have. And this is the time you could pull up the. So I wanted to show 2 lessons that this is the website. This is SPP. This is what's happening right now. So I think it's kind of cool that it's real time. Okay, let's just look at this graph. This is happening right now. So this is the wind. This is the wind forecast. It goes out 7 days, this green. Last night, this is our load. And so as we had a low load, we had this gap. Can anyone tell me what that gap was for? That we forecasted wind here, but it actually came in, almost 5 gigs different. Anyone tell me what that is? Just being intuitive. Speak up if you. We hit. You can. There's really no wrong answer. We hit some transmission congestion, but we also had a supply problem. We have generation online, and we're hitting what's called negative marginal energy costs, which is basically wind on the margin. And so wind is competing against wind, and so it's curtailing itself because our pricing is going below their offer curve of whatever a PTC is, negative $24, and then maybe even they have a PPA, so it's another $30, $40, and so MECs are going past negative $64. And so we're losing a lot of 5 gigs. So I want to look at this as positive and negative, right? So there's some lessons learned just looking at what happened last night and what's happening right now as we speak during the day. One is there's opportunity here because this is basically spilled wind. It's 5 gigawatts. That's a lot of energy that did not get delivered. And the question is it a transmission problem? Is it a supply and demand problem? Could we have exported it? Could we, build up the DC ties to the west? Could we bypass the DC ties to the west? We have, at times, more wind than we know what to do with. We can't just all sink it into SPP. So that's one thing, and that you can look at as a positive and an opportunity. Another thing is this is kind of a con, because you look at this, what we could prepare for, And then you look, where were we supposed to be? 21 gigs, a little bit over 21 gigs. Where are we going to be later tomorrow? At 2,000, about 2,500 megawatts. So a constant steady stream down, and we need to be able to forecast when these happen. So this ramp down, that ramp down, that ramp down, what is going to be there? Well, right now we don't have any solar, so we use gas, we use coal. And so we need to make sure that we're valuing those generators over this transition period and making sure that they stick around long enough for us to properly transition and continue to transition with wind and solar and batteries. So I think that's really key. I could almost repeat myself almost exactly, but it's very key that we value these attributes that are coming when the wind isn't there. And you could say, okay, well, the solar matches it. Well, that's only these 12 hours at this point, not all of this point where it's at night, and not all of this point. Or, over here, it's going down before the sun's even up. So we need to make sure that we have the appropriate generation mix to be able to mesh well with our transition. And for me, I think it's probably going to take my career until we see the full. You have what the Biden plan is 2035. I think we're doing a 20-year assessment for 2042. It's going to be a period of time. Now we're moving the ball forward, and that's a positive thing from an industry perspective. But we just need to make sure that we're doing it appropriately in lockstep with operations. So as we're valuing resource adequacy, as we're planning the transmission system, as you guys are planning your particular resource mix, we're also planning for what operations needs to do and what markets needs to do, and kind of have to. I almost see it like a carnival. Have you guys ever played that water gun thing where there's like a bunch of horses and some kid aims real well and all of a sudden a horse jumps? Well, we need to make sure that all the horses come to the finish line at the same time. Because if one horse gets there first, like if we all of a sudden install a bunch of solar, but we weren't really prepared for the loss of solar, then we're in trouble. So we need to make sure all that's together. I want to time check. Is that 10 minutes? Okay. We can go back to the PowerPoint, and then if there's any questions, I want to spend just maybe, I'm going to wrap up with just the resource initiatives for this winter event, because we were doing a lot of this before the winter event, and not that the winter event was by any means a good thing. But, just like the pandemic, you try to, I don't know, maybe it's human nature. You just try to glean something out of a positive or a lessons learned. And one of the good things to me was the fact that now we have a lot of emphasis on what we were already doing from a resource adequacy perspective. And so, what we're doing is, and we're not picking on wind and solar. I mean, we're looking at all the different, so wind has certain attributes, and we're actually trying to go for what's called the effective load carrying capability, which is better and more effective, no pun intended, than what we currently have from a resource adequacy methodology. We're also looking at conventional resources and looking at performance-based accreditation. I mentioned gas was a big problem with the winter weather event. And so now we're saying, okay, well, how much of that was accredited that we should have been able to count on and we couldn't? And so then the question is, let's figure out a way to value those that actually showed up, and those that perform need to be the ones that actually get credited. And so that is some of the performance-based accreditation. We're looking at forced outage rate. Those that are in the industry in that area, it's called unforced capacity, UCAP, and right now we're doing installed capacity, what's called ICAP. So we're working towards that. VER accreditation, there is a value to wind, and there is a value to solar. There's even a value to batteries. We've worked on, even though batteries don't actually generate a megawatt, they time shift a megawatt. But since they time shift and we have a certain load profile, there is a certain amount of value of batteries. And what we're trying to do is give that value such that it makes a good business case. We encourage more batteries to be installed. But again, they don't generate a megawatt. So you can't run you can't just say, let's have 40 gigs of batteries and that's going to meet our capacity. That's just not going to work. I don't even have to run a study. It's just not going to work. And so, but there is some value to those batteries that we need to give so that it helps build that business case and encourage those particular attributes to be embedded into an energy storage business case and get built. It's great. And then we have the PRMs talking about where we're at from a planning reserve margin and analysis. We're talking about doing a winter assessment, maybe further assessments. We are really trying to balance how much more. We don't want to put on policies that cost members money that don't make sense. So it's a matter of balancing. I keep going back to that winter weather event. I think that's the big question, is how much do we want to prepare for? And that's really what it comes down to. There are, as we mentioned, from a Tier 1 through Tier 3 recommendations, there's room to improve without spending an enormous amount of money from increasing the capacity. But there is a question out there of what we can do next time. Because if the winter event happens this February, we've already had additional retirements. So if someone asks me, well, are we prepared for February? Yeah, I mean, we have the operators more trained, members are more trained, everybody has been through it, but at the same time, did we build a lot of controllable generation? Has the gas industry built up their particular winterization? I mean, it's hard to say. So that's the question of how much further we can get to be more resilient for these particular events. With that, I know we're at time, so I don't know if we can answer a question or two. But
if I understood the timeline right, one of the things that you said was that there was power migration going to that we were receiving, that we were then sharing with ERCOT.
Yes.
And that when ERCOT ran into more difficult problems elsewhere, that we lost that capacity to receive some of that power, and that resulted in sort of the blackouts. So as you talk about the sort of updates that SPP is doing, are there updates the other ISOs are doing as well? And is it coordinated? Because if we do this on our own, aren't we just going to have the same problem again?
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. We're working with MISO and ERCOT as well. In fact, we were working with ERCOT on certain emergency situations, such as grid switchers, because we do have a couple of grid switching units, and whether or not we have enhanced that process over the last few years, but that's just another example. If SPP was not an issue, and ERCOT was an emergency issue, then could you switch the power plants from one grid to another and help ERCOT in that situation? But yes, there's a coordinated effort from a recommendation perspective. But the timeline that I reviewed from the IRATF and those tiers, that's SPP specific. That's a board-driven project.
What's the grid's position or outlook on nuclear generation in the foreseeable future? Any coming online or any specific position you guys have?
No, I mean, from an SPP perspective, we're fuel type agnostic, and there's 0 nuclear facilities in the queue. That said, I mean, it's all about business case. I mean, my personal opinion is it's extremely expensive at least now, to build a traditional nuclear facility. But there are newer technologies out there that might make it a viable business case.
You mentioned a little bit about getting across the grid, the western grid and eastern grid. And I know there's a proposal that would get a high voltage DC line through there. But I'm wondering what has happened, and I understand I'm not sure I understand why we need to go across the grid when we've got a lot of wind energy that could be shipped to the east. And it seems to me like having a high voltage grid, DC line going east would make as much sense as trying to get across the gates here.
I'll answer that in a couple of parts. One is there are a number of studies out there about building the interstate system for the grid, a macro grid for the United States. I think those are good. I mean, it's kind of academic exercises to at least illustrate to transmission planners what is possible, and we can kind of chisel through that. We've had the Wind Catcher project for AEP. We've had the Clean Line project. Invenergy has a project. There's some projects that are out there. Some of them fell through. Some of them are still continuing on. So I think there's business cases to make a HVDC line that moves to east. When I mention the west, is we're working with RTO West, which is somewhat of our expansion to the SPP footprint into the WEC area. And when you talk about some of the older aging facilities of the DC ties between the western and eastern interconnection, the question is what is optimal for everyone. in the future, and you know, should you upgrade those DC ties for better import or transfer capability, or you know, should you bypass the DC ties, or I mean, what would be the most reliable and economical solution? And that's yet to be determined, because some of the information that I've seen is there is viability in those options as opposed to building, you know, kind of a massive DC line grid.
As I understand it, the resource adequacy, when you have that evaluated, you can base it on your adequacy to meet summer peak. And do you see a change, in part based on what happened this February, to more emphasis on both summer and winter peak? And how do you see peaking changing, say, in 15 years if we're using a lot more electricity for heating and a lot less gas?
Yeah, we've actually already started to see that trend from an electrification perspective. We're actually seeing more energy use, but less peaking, which is it's already kind of telling regionally. I mean, this is rolled up data, but right here is the winter PRM. So to answer your question, we're looking at, should we have a separate winter PRM, and what does that do for resource planners? Thank you.
All right, let's give it up for Casey.